Hi, my name is Linda Joy Myers, and I'm going to be here today talking about the story behind the story. And my guest is Michelle Cox. Welcome.
Hi, Linda. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, Michelle. It's great to be hanging out with you talking about historical fiction. So I've just, as you know, I've just recently getting my first novel published called The Forger of Marseille. It's historical fiction. I have all this memoir background, founded the National Association of Memoir Writers, and I've written 2 memoirs. So this is a new genre for me, which I love, and I love your books. So thank you for being here with me.
Oh, you're welcome. I read A Forger of Marseille, and it's a beautiful book. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Great to have a fan. So let me just talk a little bit more about you here for a second, and then we'll dive into some pithy things that we really want to talk about together. So Michelle Cox is the author of the multiple award-winning Henrietta and Inspector Howard series, and also a blog, which I need to read, Novel Notes of Local Lore, a weekly blog dedicated to Chicago's forgotten residents. That's very intriguing. Tell me more in a minute. She suspects she may have once lived in the 30s, and having yet to discover a handy time machine lying around, she's resorted to writing about the era as a way of getting herself back there. That is intriguing.
Isn't it?
Well, actually, what's interesting when I read your blog posts and stuff, my grandmother and mother lived there in the 30s.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yes, right.
Wow, that's fascinating. I'll have to interview you and get your story, put it in the blog.
We'll see how much I know. But anyway, so you really bring forward a time and a place. And that's the job of historical fiction, is to bring alive a time that's gone by and a place that doesn't exist anymore in the way that it did then.
Exactly. Yeah, I love it.
Well, tell me how you did get started with writing your series, this idea of even writing historical fiction.
Well, that's a good question. Because I wrote a different historical fiction novel before the series, and that, no one likes to think about their first novel as being your starter novel, your practice novel, but it was. And I tried to get it published for, I don't know, over a year, and it went nowhere, and there was lots of problems with it. So without delving into that, the short version of the story is that I decided to start over. So you can only fix something so many times before you just need to set it aside and just say, that's done. Mm-hmm. So I really wanted to write a mystery, because at that time in my career, which is at the very beginning, I really, really wanted an agent. And so I stupidly thought that writing a mystery would make myself more appealing to them. And so I thought, okay, I'll just write this quick mystery, and, I'll use this to sort of get my foot in the door. Well, I always need a little kernel of truth. So I have to start with something, and then I can take that and run with it. So as you mentioned in my blog, I have hundreds of stories from my time working in a nursing home. And so every week I write about a different Chicago resident, and I've kept some of the best ones for potential novels. So when I was looking for an idea, kernel of truth for this first book, which was A Girl Like You, I took a woman's story from the nursing home, and I based A Girl Like You, or the character of Henrietta, very closely on her. So of course I had to invent a murder and the inspector and all of that kind of stuff, but a lot of what happens in book 1 really did happen.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That is really intriguing. Well, yeah, so here you're talking about the seed and the kernel. Well, what's interesting to me about that is that you're using basically as a foundation an inspiration from a memoir from somebody's real life. And when I was writing The Forger of Marseille, the stories, large history books are just going to go on the surface. But the stories that took me down deep into the rescues that some of these real life heroes did were reading their memoirs. And what was it like day to day to be in Marseille? What was it like day to day to rescue British soldiers or Jewish refugees or artists or whatever? And, you sort of feel the grit of the time and the life when you've got something from somebody's real life.
Yeah, it's incredible. It makes it so much more personal and human, so much more real. Like you say, you can read 100 history books, but unless you really dive into a real story, it's hard to get that sort of essence.
Well, tell me about how then so you have your characters living in a Chicago, some of which still exists, but not in the same way at all. So
Sure.
Tell me about your research. I mean, we know about research rapture, right? Tell me about yours.
Well, I'm like the oddest historical fiction writer probably because I don't do a lot of research ahead of time, only because I have found that it's just too easy to go down into those rabbit holes, and also that you have too much in your head. And so your desire to tell somebody all of these cool facts really, for me, interferes with the telling of the story. So and that happened in one of the books. It was actually book 4 of the series of Veil Removed, where I did a lot of research on a town, one of the suburbs that they were in. And it was so incredibly fascinating. And then I just kept having to cut the manuscript and cut it and cut it and cut it. And I thought, this was a huge waste of time. So now ahead of time, if I need, if I know that I would just write the story and I write X's, XXXX, and that's a flag for me to come back and fill that in. And I find that doing it sort of retro makes it easier, and I don't spend days and weeks or months, learning about something that's never going to be in the book.
Like I did. That's what I did. Yeah. Well, I've been reading history of World War II for 40 years. And so I've been in history, Oh God, I was so fascinated. And, so, I mean, to say that I have a foundation was, it's more than enough foundation, but I didn't know what you know. And so that's part of why I want to talk to you as a fiction writer. It was my first fictional book. And, so there's things that about the research, thank you, that I think people need to know about, what to be careful of, maybe how to trust. So let's get into this, how to trust your own imagination. So tell me more about how did you develop Inspector Howard? How did you develop your characters and your setting?
Yeah, I really wanted it, to be honest, my sort of love of the past really centers more on the 40s, and that the first book that I wrote that went nowhere was set in the 40s in a neighborhood in Chicago called Jefferson Park. And that was heavily researched. And again, that was kind of my learning process. And when I switched over to Henrietta and Inspector Howard, I set it in the 30s because the woman whom I based Henrietta on had a job at the World's Fair in Chicago, which is in 33. And I really wanted to put that detail in the book. And at the time, I thought I was only writing a one-off. So I thought, well,
okay.
So I can write one book in the 30s, and then it turned into a whole series, but we'll get into that in a minute. So I do have sort of an affinity for the 40s, but the 30s is very close in many ways. And I'm glad that I set it in the 30s now, because it's kind of a lost era. So it's wedged between the two wars. It's the Great Depression. There's not a lot of series or fiction about that time. So I felt like actually it worked out really well. And I think your question is great, because recently I was listening to a podcast, Joanna Penn, the Creative Penn podcast, and she was interviewing, and I can't remember, Becca something. And she is an intuitive writer. And that's the first time that I had heard that term. And I thought, oh my God, that's me. Because I feel like I am very much an intuitive writer, that I have a lot of this already in my mind, especially the history. I was always that kid at the family party that was listening to the adult. Yeah, I loved all the old stories. And I just think I've been collecting data all my life. And so using how I came up with the other characters, some of it is just popular culture. Some of it is, books that I've read before, or even movies. Like, in some ways, I've never admitted this on a podcast, and I've probably been on quite a few by now, that I actually based a lot of sort of the action on this movie called American Dreamer. And it was with Jo Beth Williams and Tom Conti. Yeah. So like there's this big twist at the end, and I didn't know what I was doing writing a mystery. And so I sort of based it on that and filled in the blanks as I went along. But I do feel like I'm very much an intuitive writer.
Does that mean one of the terms that you're a pantser? Does that mean you don't outline much?
No, I'm like a weirdo. I especially the early books, I very heavily outlined because I think I was nervous to write a mystery, and I wanted to make sure that I had the pacing. And in some ways, I'm glad that I started with mystery, because, it's kind of like every chapter is precious. I think of myself sometimes as a director of like a big period drama, like a streaming series thing, where not every episode can have every character. And every scene, is costing hundreds of thousands of dollars to film. So I've got to kind of have that same mindset where there's no room for waste. So you have to get across what you want to get across and then move on. So it really kind of taught me pacing.
Okay.
But as time has gone on, I have allowed myself to have a rough outline, but have enough room to sort of think of things as I go along. So I'm kind of both.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great combination. I mean, I wrote for a while this book without having an outline, and then suffered. Well, I learned a lot. I mean, just writing teaches you how to write. It was my first fiction, how to create characters. I didn't know. I'm like, well, I intuitively, certain things. And then one of them is based on a real person that I used to know, but totally fictionalized in Germany and the 30s and in France and so on. But I don't know, I guess it's this combination of inspiration, perspiration, and I mean, even trusting that maybe our intuition can go somewhere, and then bringing in the structure of plots and events and what happens, and marrying those together.
Yes, I think that's the perfect blend if you can achieve it, for sure.
So, so then you fell in love with this genre. So after you wrote the first one, what was happening? Was seeds starting to bloom and blossom as you wrote the first one?
Yeah, for sure. When I started book one, I was still very much attached to the characters of my failed story. And it took about halfway through this book to really fall in love with Clive and Henrietta. And so much so that I didn't want the book to end. I didn't want to let them go. I was myself kind of captivated by the world that I had built, and I wanted to stay in that world. So I thought, oh, I know, I'll make it a series. And so I very quickly started writing book 2 after I finished book 1. But the problem there is I didn't know a lot about series writing. I have since learned a lot. I would have completely set it up in a different way. And I wasn't really super excited about writing about a cop and his wife in Chicago in the 30s. I felt that that had already kind of been done. It also wasn't where my heart was, so I wanted somebody to have a secret background. And Clive volunteered. So Clive became the sort of heir to this very wealthy North Shore estate. And so that creates a lot of drama. And also I thought really sort of helps tell the story of what was happening at the time. You have so much of the country thrown into poverty, and then but you still have this elite that, the Depression hasn't really touched them. And so that also creates a lot of drama between the different layers of characters going through the series.
That's fascinating. So Clive was, I forget, he's the brother of somebody's brother, is that right?
Clive is the inspector.
Oh, okay. But there's some other people involved in that family. Okay.
There's a ton.
Yeah, right. Well, having the backstory, I mean, that's sort of the psychological fun aspect of, okay, where did they come from and how, and you just have to let your imagination roll. But you have examples in that era, and were there people that lived at that time in that era that were inspiring you to look at their background?
Not really. I mean, it sort of touches on Al Capone, of course, but and his sort of reverberations, because at the time he was already in Alcatraz during the 30s, but he still had a huge influence in Chicago. And so he kind of plays into it. And then eventually the series moves over to England and the aristocracy there, and those are all just sort of made up characters. So
that's fun. Well, the last one I read is when they end up in Germany during the era that I'm writing about.
Yes.
Somebody gave me that book for Christmas.
Oh.
And I'm like, oh, Nazis. Okay.
Yes, that was a fun book to write. And that did take some research, because that was very much based on real things that happened. It's fascinating. So I really enjoyed that.
I was reading it going, oh, she found that out. No, there's that research. That was really fun for me, having some background with Germany. And then, so now where are you with your series, and what's bubbling up underneath? What's next? If you feel like you can share that.
Oh, sure. So book 7 is called A Haunting at Linley. That comes out. So it's book 7, and it's the final book of the series.
Oh, okay.
So that comes out in October. And then I have a standalone women's historical fiction coming out in February called The Fallen Woman's Daughter. Yes.
Wow, what an interesting title.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure. That's very much based on a true story I also heard in the nursing home. It's a dual timeline. So we have a young girl in the 20s in southern Iowa in the coal mining towns, and she runs away with a carnival barker when he comes through town. So one storyline is kind of her adventures with him, and then we have another timeline of these 2 little girls in the 30s who are being taken from their home and placed in a home for girls, and they don't know why they're there. They have to start navigating this strange world, and then you eventually find out that these 2 girls are the woman's daughters.
Oh my God.
So then
really interesting.
Yeah. So eventually their timelines meet, and it's all about, redemption and forgiveness and accepting and that sort of thing. They have to try to learn to live together again. So that, of course, there's lots of drama there. And so it spans the 20s and ends up in the 60s.
Oh my goodness. Well,
Yeah.
it sounds really good. I can't wait to read
Thanks.
it. You know,
Thank you.
well, you just seem to have, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is like I'm one of your fangirls, and I'm like, she has so much imagination. How did she
Thank
come up with
you.
all this stuff? Are there any, you eat cucumbers, or I mean, are there any clues?
Well, part of it is like we've been talking, is like basing, if I have a little story, a kernel of truth, I can just imagine it. Then a story starts to swirl around it.
Mm.
And I have to also make a quick pitch because I have a new series coming out in the fall, next fall. So
Hmm.
that's going to be based on Melody Merriweather, who's a character in Clive and Henrietta. And that is going to be set in a small town in Wisconsin. And that very much speaks to my own sort of growing up. I didn't live in
background.
Wisconsin, but nearby. So that kind of fuels the imagination for that story. So yeah, I don't know. Other than that,
Oh, other than that, you don't have much to do. 3 new things coming out, and really, that's wonderful. I just
thanks.
celebrate you. And so if people want to talk with you more or reach out to you, how do they find you, Michelle?
Well, you can go to my website, michellecoxwrites.com, and I have all my social media buttons there. I encourage everybody to sign up for my newsletter because you can get book one for free that way. And also I run these big giveaways every few months for my subscribers only. So some really big prizes. So I encourage you to sign up and follow me.
One of the things that I notice on Facebook is you're always presenting these really interesting desserts that were made and created in that era. Is that right?
It is every Wednesday. And I was actually thinking, wouldn't it be fun to put together a Henrietta cookbook based on all of these, sort of forgotten desserts? So that would be a fun project too.
There's that imagination going again.
Yes.
Well, this was so great. Thank you so much, Michelle Cox. The story behind the story.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for having me.
Right.